We do have some questions, so I'll run through those. Question from Dario. I think you kind of mentioned this, but if you develop and publish the tool, are you concerned about giving potential fraudsters a checklist of items to be careful about and
Yeah,
to test for before submitting their trial?
yeah, it comes up a lot. And this is one of those things where I have a long answer and sort of ramble on for a while. I'll try not to do that now. Okay. So I guess the short answer is that, well, it's complicated. But I mean, I do hope that, I think a lot of these fabricators have just done this because they've thought that they would get away with it and that no one would really bother to check. Now, what I kind of hope is if we can move to a position where people are systematically, routinely checking for fabrication, considering the fact that the data might not be authentic, that in itself is going to be quite prohibitive. People are on the lookout for this now, okay? You're not going to get away with it, okay? Mm-hmm. But, there may be a class of fabricators who are already a bit more sophisticated. They are using like simulation methods and stuff to create some slightly better looking, more convincing data sets. If so, there's quite a high chance that we're not detecting those kinds of people anyway, I guess. So in that regard, I'm not sure if anything would change for those kinds of people. That's my attempt to say it's complicated in a short time as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Another question from Dario. Did you think about potential uses of AI in creating fraudulent trials and how these developments could affect your project?
Yep, that's interesting. So I guess the last answer is kind of relevant in a way. So I think there are potentially two classes of fabricators. There's one class who are sort of very low skill. They're using very crude methods of fabrication. They're typing numbers in spreadsheets. They're copy and pasting things. Okay, very easy to detect. All right. Now the concern is that, for example, large language models such as ChatGPT will lower the bar to creating better looking fabricated data. That's the hypothetical concern. Now, at the moment, it is hypothetical because all the data sets I've looked at where we've tried to generate good data sets from ChatGPT are rubbish. Okay, they're not convincing at all. But things might improve. So yeah, that's something we need to be cognizant of, and hopefully we'll have a PhD starting soon who's going to be looking into that as part of this process. Okay. However, there's like the second class of people that I mentioned before. So for the people who could use sophisticated statistical methods already to do this, I don't think anything's really changed there, right? Because it would already be possible to use like decent modeling simulation type methods to create quite convincing data sets already that would already be quite hard to detect. So I'm not sure if the advent of better models or more sophisticated AI changed anything amongst that group of fabricators, I guess. So the concern is, as you say, more like the large language models lowering the bar for the low skilled fabricators, I suppose. But again, as I say, we hope that all of this will be preventative. It'll put people off from trying in the first place.
Great, thank you. A question from Miranda. Some papers on this topic have suggested blanket rules for excluding studies, for example, based on the nationality of the authors or the trial registration status. Do you have any thoughts about blanket rules for excluding a study?
I suspect what's going to happen is that we'll come up with this tool and it'll give some criteria for raising concerns, basically. All right. And again, they're going to be backed by large scale consensus. So I can't ever envision that anyone would think it was a good idea to exclude all trials if they took place in a particular country. All right. I can't imagine anybody thinking that was a sensible or good or fair thing to do. So I don't know, we'll see. As I kind of mentioned in an answer earlier, though, exactly what the tool is going to look like, what we're going to recommend, how we're going to recommend, turning these checks into a recommendation or an overall assessment, that is very much still, on the table, I suppose. It's still to be determined. So.
Right, thank you. A question from Aphrodite. Very interesting, Jack. What do you generally propose to be done after identifying at least one RCT with fraudulent data in a review that's been published?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I kind of think that in some sense that's not my decision or not my concern. So I'm kind of more concerned with how to identify these studies in the first place. Okay. And then in terms of like procedural stuff into how we should deal with them, that's maybe for someone else to decide. I mean, perhaps I think other people in this call would probably know better than I would what sort of Cochrane editorial policy is around, how we respond and what procedures we go through when we identify problematic studies in a review that's already been published. So I can't really speak to that. I'm not formally affiliated with Cochrane in that way. But again, that would be useful to hear a bit more about. I think I will mention briefly, there's been some recent work showing that I'm not sure if you're talking about your own systematic review or if you notice a problematic study in the systematic review of someone else. But there has been some recent work from Alison Avenel and colleagues. And basically they just found some retracted trials, okay? And they found systematic reviews that had included these retracted trials, possibly prior to or possibly post-retraction, okay? And what they did is they just contacted all the authors of the systematic reviews. They contacted the journal editors to sort of say like, hey, look, you've done this systematic review and you've included some retracted studies. Do you think maybe you should do something about it? I'm oversimplifying slightly, but the general response they got was, not our problem, who cares? It was right at the time, which is a bit concerning, right?
Yeah. A comment from Oye Kola, brilliant presentation. And a question from Emma. If review authors have concerns with the trial after using the tool rather, should they contact the journal it was published in to report concerns? I do know that is part of the Cochrane policy. Yeah, I would advise people to double check, the current policy on the Cochrane website. But I do know that one of the things they advise is that the journal should investigate. If they're concerned, they should let the journal editors know for them to investigate. Is that your understanding, Jack?
Yeah. I mean, as you said, Rachel, there's the policy on managing potentially problematic studies, which describes all this in detail. And just to be clear, I don't know if I've given the wrong impression or anything, but I had no involvement in authoring that policy or anything like that. So I'm not the best person to ask about the ins and outs of that particular policy. But yeah, so my understanding is that that policy does recommend following the steps set out by COPE, basically, right, where you're going to contact the journal.
Yeah. A question from Sophia. Great talk, thank you. You mentioned that you've been working on automating the tool. So you're planning to develop a platform or a software package for automation?
So I've definitely not been working on automating anything at all. So I just mentioned some work by Colby Borland. He's just creating some software that would automate some of these checks. So it would, identify a baseline table in a published study, which it does turn out can be quite useful for identifying some problems. And he can, the idea is his software will automatically run some of those checks on that baseline table. So that's in development. I mean, in terms of how much of this can be automated, I don't know. The jury's still out, right? I mean, people are always saying, can we automate risk of bias assessment and stuff like that? And I remain pretty skeptical. But maybe some of these sort of more statistical checks could be potentially automated. The problem is a lot of this stuff isn't statistical, right? To be clear, a lot of this stuff is not statistical. Some of that stuff is going to require some sort of assessment of plausibility, feasibility, and that kind of thing. Can that be automated? I'm skeptical, but it's possible. Who knows?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Okay, Ella's helpfully put the link to our policy in the chat for anybody who wants to check that out. Thanks so much, Ella. And some detailed guidance. That's really helpful. Thank you. I had a quick question actually. More sort of philosophical, I guess. No. I don't know. I've worked in systematic reviews and trials for a long time, and I still have a kind of instinctive reaction that people can't possibly fabricate trials, and how could you do anything that is so, flagrantly outrageous? And I think people feel, there's kind of a kind of gentleman's agreement, that research is genuine. And do you think that this is a real barrier to kind of, people getting their heads around this and implementing the tool?
I don't know. So a lot of people are like, well, yes, so many good issues there. You're right. So I think you're right, Rachel, that this just doesn't even occur to people, right? The possibility that the research could be inauthentic just does not cross people's minds. So part of this is like consciousness raising, I suppose, right? Trying to, just highlight the fact that this is actually quite common, unfortunately. I think over the past few years, I've probably dealt with about 50 cases, and they didn't all turn out to be fake, but quite a large portion of them did turn out to be fake. This is happening, right? There were some other sort of issues you raised there, right? So how can people do this, right? How can people fabricate data that actually is going to have an impact on patient care? I don't know, right? I don't know, but they have done it, right? Whatever kind of cognitive dissonance that takes, to be able to do that. I'm going to do this to advance my own career, even though it might be harmful to people. I don't know how people do that. But there have been like lots of suggestions that, look, we've got this wrong. We shouldn't be focusing on detecting these studies, right? We should be focusing on this, right? We need to put much more emphasis on prevention and teaching people why this is wrong and about good research integrity practices. Fine. We should do all that as well. I totally agree. But the fact that, I don't know, are we going to switch on people's ethical compass or whatever? That was a horrible mixed metaphor there, but hopefully the point was clear. I don't know, people, I've had no qualms about doing this, and I think the implications are quite clear. So I don't know, I'm not sure if we're going to stamp out the problem just by getting people to become more honest or better people.
And there's such pressure on people to publish, isn't there, as well, these days? There's massive pressure on academics, and so you can see perhaps where the motivation comes from a little bit.
100%. People are doing it for career reasons, and some people have made some quite nice careers out of fabricating lots and lots of trials, it looks like. Some of those houses of cards are now tumbling down, I suppose, is the thing. But yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Hopefully we can just squeeze a couple more questions in. So a question from Myra. Should these checks be done by reviewers or editors at the time of initial submission, prior to the publication of each file, rather than waiting for the review?
Again, loads to say there. So 2 reasons why we've initially targeted the systematic review stage. So the first one of those is that, as I said, right, systematic reviews try to include trials regardless of where they've been published, okay? Now, many journals are not going to adhere to high standards of scientific integrity in publishing, right? It's just not going to happen, either because of resources, either because they're driven by financial considerations primarily, or they just don't care, whatever, right? So if we were to target this at the journal stage, okay, I think many journals would just choose to ignore that. These problematic studies would be published anyway, and then we still have the problem that they're going to be pulled into the systematic review, okay? So that's one reason why we've targeted it at the systematic review stage. Consideration number 2 is that during the systematic review stage, when you've got all of the trials on the same topic under consideration at the same time, that in and of itself might be useful for highlighting problems, because you can make comparisons between the trials. And I showed you the example earlier of the trials from one author where the results were just really discordant, really discrepant compared to the other ones. So it opens up some more possibilities in terms of checking across studies. But I guess a final point is that, but yes, also you're right, I guess, right? So we're starting here, but as we continue with this work, we need to think about how we could adapt all of these tools so that they could be used during editorial by journals and stuff like that. In particular, I think the Inspect IPD tool would be useful for sort of statistical reviewers. At the moment, there isn't a lot of understanding on how to do this kind of thing. And I've seen a lot of cases where journals have sent their integrity cases to the statistical reviewer to have a look at the data. But just knowing about statistics isn't the same as knowing about methods for assessing authenticity. And so a lot of those statistical integrity reviews are just useless, basically, right? They tend to focus on was the right test used and stuff like that, which just isn't addressing the concern. So I think, the Inspect IPD tool might be of great use for journals.
Brilliant, thanks, Jack. And a final question from Dario. Is there any criteria to be able to unambiguously say that a trial is fraudulent?
No, I doubt it.
No.
And again, it's not what we're trying to achieve, right?
Yeah.
So we're trying to establish consensus around some criteria that people are happy to say, like, well, if a study fails to meet these criteria, we're not willing to trust it in our systematic review. That's all that we're saying, okay? We're not trying to accuse anyone of fraud at any point or anything like that. We're saying we are not happy to trust the integrity of this trial or the authenticity of this trial. But you're never going to get some sort of, perfect diagnostic test type thing, which can sort of see, pure truth. This was faked. This was not. These are just errors. I think that's fantasy.